The idea of a soul has fascinated mankind for millennia. Early burial sites suggest ritualised beliefs stretch back 30,000 years or more, and yet here we are still pondering whether there is something more than the physical to the human experience. To answer the question of whether souls exist, we must start by defining what a soul is. According to Aristotle, each entity capable of some kind of self-activity contains a soul, which is a body internal capacity that is sometimes exercised and sometimes not. During the Middle Ages, Aristotle's ideas were synthesized with the religious view of a personal soul which can die and then be resurrected. St. Thomas Aquinas, the influential Catholic philosopher, argued that all organisms have souls, but only human souls are immortal. The idea of life after death is problematic for philosophers, since we can only justify such a belief eschatologically, at the end of things, and therefore a meaningful discussion becomes problematic. As a result, philosophers tend to focus on the idea of the soul as a distinct entity, separate from the body, which is responsible for feeling, thought, and action. In other words, the soul is the non-physical mind and is the very essence of what it is to be a human being. Those who argue that the mind and the body are separate things are called mind-body dualists. For dualists like René Descartes, the mind is not the living brain. Descartes pointed out that he had a distinct idea of a thinking mind and a distinct idea of a physical body. So mental processes are not the same as physical ones. Mental processes occur in the mind, not in the body, and the mind is not the living brain. Dualism is a popular view. Many instinctively agree that there is something special about the human mind or soul. But the problem with positing a spiritual part to humans as distinct from the physical part is, how do we explain the relationship between the non-physical mind and the physical body? Philosophers are apt to point out that the only evidence that can be presented in favour of a separate, non-physical mind is introspection. What Descartes is really saying is that it feels like the mind is separate, but how can we scientifically investigate the idea of a non-physical substance? What evidence we have from science suggests that damage to the brain results in damage to the mind, suggesting that the two are closely linked. Another serious problem with dualism is, how can the mind interact with the physical body? If mind is not in space, how can it affect or be affected by things in space? How can a thing without mass move a thing with mass? Believers posit God as a connection between the mind and the body through some sort of parallelism. But arguments that require a supernatural explanation are philosophically weak. Those who argue that the mind and the body are not separate things are called physicalists. Physicalism argues that mind is brain and insists that this is an empirical hypothesis for which there is overwhelming evidence. They point out that dualists have never given a convincing explanation of how mind interacts with body, and argue that postulating a second mysterious substance called the soul does not make the existence of mental states any easier to understand. Physicalism is a form of monism, the view that there is just one sort of substance in the universe, the physical. Some philosophers feel that we should apply the principle of Occam's razor to the question of human souls. This problem-solving principle, conceived by the English friar William of Ockham, argues that among competing hypotheses, the one with the fewest assumptions should be suggested. Australian philosopher Jack Smart pointed out that it is inconceivable that everything in the universe is made up of a complex arrangement of physical matter and is explicable in scientific terms, except minds. What makes us so special that the only non-physical thing in the universe just happens to be in our heads? Occam's razor may tell us to keep things simple, but the problem with presenting the human condition as purely physical is that this explanation fails to explain what it is like to have a mind. There are features of the mental which many argue cannot be explained in physical terms. Conscious experiences such as joy, pain, and desire, what philosophers call qualia, have a particular feel, and to try to reduce them simply to a brain state offers no explanation of how this could possibly be so. Surely feelings don't just describe an inanimate object. If we accept monism, we have to accept that the human state could be artificially created, since it is nothing more than a complicated physical condition. But can we really imagine a supercomputer that is truly conscious and feels in the way that a human does? One response to the problem of qualia is to deny they exist, so-called eliminative materialism. However, denying the existence of an inner mental life seems ridiculous in the face of human emotions and the joy of being conscious. Other physicalists accept irreducible mental properties, but argue that qualia are just the way in which the brain appears to us, a phenomenon which sits above the brain without causing any of what goes on. Once again, we find ourselves stuck with no real answer to the question. The non-physical is unprovable, but qualia are undeniable. One solution to this mind-body problem is to stop all talk of minds and instead focus on what we can experience: behavior. Behaviourism claims that when we talk of minds, all we are really talking about is behaviour which is public and observable. When I see a girl crying, I can say she is sad, but what I am really saying is that she is behaving in a way which makes me think that she is sad. The beauty of this argument is that the mind-body problem is gone. We no longer need to speak of mind, just behaviour. Although not himself a behaviourist, Gilbert Ryle argued that when we describe mental states separately from behaviour, we are led into the belief that the mind is separate, the so-called dogma of the ghost in the machine. The problem with behaviourism is that if our crying girl is pretending to be sad, but inside is really happy, then surely her mind is not her behaviour. When we refer to other people's mental states, we may be describing behaviour and infer a mind. But what about the feeling we have of being conscious? Surely qualia is not just behaviour. To conclude, I would argue that non-physical minds or souls do exist, at least in the sense that there is something which presents itself to us in the human experience as separate to the physical body. We can't meaningfully discuss the idea of an immortal soul, but we can have a conversation about qualia, which seems central to the human condition. Qualia feel separate and distinct. They are what makes my experience of life what it is. A convinced skeptic might point out that qualia are just the way in which the brain appears to us, and that without the physical brain, there would be no qualia. But I would respond by putting on a Pat Metheny record and pointing out that the existence of qualia makes my conscious experience of the music what it is. I may not have an immortal soul in the religious sense, and there probably are no body-independent mind phenomena, but the way my life presents itself to me is special, and the feeling of being human deserves a little mystery. If only to keep us wondering for another 30,000 years.